Good afternoon, everyone. Since we are running on schedule today, we'll be starting today's session. This is the fourth live session of the webinar 1.0 on rethinking vernacular architecture, documentation, and lessons. Uh, Today we have with us Dr. Sateesh Pasupuleti. We're very thankful that you have joined us today, sir. Uh, Before he begins his presentation, I would like to just inform you about what the presentation will be and give you a brief introduction to sir. So this lecture will provide an overview of culture, place, and risk phenomenon in the context of disaster recovery and build back better approaches. Here, how different build back better has adopted top down and bottom down, both participatory approaches. It articulates on how different local communities across the globe have adopted or have responded to such cataclysmic changes that have occurred through disaster development processes. And case studies shall include few primary case studies from India and Sweden, and a few secondary studies from Peru, Colombia, and Turkey. Based on the understanding of a variety of build back processes and responses, this presentation concludes on the determinants of the reproduction of a vernacular place in the disaster development context. A little bit about Dr. Sateesh sir. He's an architect and expert in vernacular architecture. He has done his BArch from School of Architecture and Planning, JNTU Hyderabad in 2003. He completed his MA in International Studies in Vernacular Architecture in 2005 from ISVA, Oxford Brookes University, Oxford, UK. His PhD was Understanding the Role of Culture in Post-Disaster Development Contexts, the case of tsunami reconstruction in Tamil Nadu, southern India. From the University of Westminster, SABE, Department of Urban Development and Regeneration, London, UK in 2011. Currently, he is an assistant professor at IIT Roorkee at the Department of Architecture and Planning. We welcome you, sir. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to all of us for taking time out and joining us today in the afternoon. Before we begin, I would like to request all of you to turn off your mics. Also, a very kind and sincere request to not annotate at all during the course of this presentation. And a gentle reminder also that this presentation will be followed by a panel discussion at 4:30. So please don't leave. Please stay signed in. With this, I would like to hand over the floor to Dr. Sateesh and request him to start his presentation. So please unmute.
Yeah, thank you, Shreeamey.
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, your screen is visible, sir.
It's visible?
Yeah. A kind reminder, sir, to disable annotations from your end also.
Okay.
If you're able to do that.
Yeah, just a minute. Disable participants annotation, right?
Yes, yes, sir. Very much.
Okay.
Yes, so we can begin. We are also live on Facebook.
Sure.
That I hand it over to you, sir.
Okay. Yeah. So, very good evening to all the participants and the ICOMOS coordinators. And first of all, thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak about my understanding on the disaster recovery on Build Back Better. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Perfectly audible.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So today I'm going to discuss about this vernacular places and how they have been transforming in the context of disaster recovery and Build Back Better. So I'll basically start most of my presentation with one of the slides so that when I was in my bachelor's, these photographs have changed my whole journey. In fact, these photographs, what we are seeing here is on the right-hand side is the Latur recovery programs, and one is in the geodesic domes in Gujarat. So that time I was a bachelor student, and so the very first person came in my mind was, why these houses are empty, like 200 houses around this area was even today, they are unoccupied. So the very first person came to my mind was why a lot of technological investment and the practical construction approaches have failed. What made the communities to reject these houses? This was the very first question which came into my mind. And then when I started visiting to Gujarat and other places, then I realized that this is not about an architect's singular approach towards the recovery program, like a house for house, but it is beyond it, how their livelihood aspects, how their cultural aspects, the social aspects, how they're ignored in the recovery process. So this is how I started my journey. And then after that, I moved, after working here in India, I moved back to the UK. And there I was working in a company, in advanced timber, Benfield Advanced Timber Frame Technologies, where I got an opportunity to work on, that time, there was a Kashmir earthquake. And we had a client from UNWTO, World Tourism Organization, and they have asked us to develop certain prefab houses in the current Pakistan occupied Kashmir area. So there I was working as a design person, and then my job is to manufacture these houses in Britain, put them in the ship, and then it reaches to Pakistan. And then within 21 days, they built about 70, 80 houses in that region. So these are all the prefab approaches. And this is where I realized a villain in myself, So because working from the business sector also, how the client's approach towards the post-disaster recovery is very different than what I have realized during my bachelor's. And since then, the many questions have come in my mind, and I started developing a proposal for my further research. And then again, after the tsunami recovery process, I've been interacting since my master's. And then I developed a proposal, I got funding through that. And then I started working on the tsunami recovery in Tamil Nadu. So which I'll be sharing a bit of it in this lecture too. And before that, I would, some of you who have, having not much of clarity between certain terminology, I would like to just, provide you some very basic understanding of what makes a disaster. So when you look at this, it's a very scenic beauty where you have the hill and there's a nice standing stone on it, and people used to watch, and people used to go there and watch. So as long as this is fine, there's no problem. Then the people are working under that mountain. They're also, they're living there. Their hamlets are nearby. But now, on one fine day, there's a big cloud burst. Now, this standing stone started tilting. Now, until this point, this was an hazard. But the moment it is striking the human population or their houses or their forests, and this is where the impact is seen, whether in terms of livelihoods, whether in terms of infrastructure, So this becomes a disaster. What happens if these landslides or these particular big stones rolls over a dense forest, right? Or a dense vegetation part? So what happens if people are living there? This is where the impact will be seen. This is the point where a hazard turns into a disaster. Hazard is a very natural phenomenon, but the disaster, it actually brings the vulnerable component into the picture. And, we have an earthquake here of 7.5 Richter scale in Gujarat. You know how many people have died. If you go for San Francisco, California, or Japan, which is prone to earthquakes, but look at how many people are dying when the earthquake strikes. This is what we are talking about, how the susceptible nature of those communities, how they are able to bear these kind of disaster impacts. And this is what we see, when something happens, what I showed you in these kind of visuals. When it rolls down, obviously it hits a huge amount of housing infrastructure. Today, every day you can see now, for the past 1 week, you're reading news about the landslides in Uttarakhand and certain highways which have been obstructed. And what happens if such hazards hit the cultural resources, our historic resources, like what happens in the BAM earthquake? Many of these cultural precincts have been damaged. does it make any loss to the society? It is not just about houses, but it is also the significance aspect of how the community are represented. I mean, this is one in the tsunami affected area, is in a place called Tarangambadi. This photo, I think it's after the reconstruction, but the right-hand side was, this was a shore temple in front of the Bay of Bengal. And many of the communities, the fishermen communities living over there, they have a kind of, the belief systems, their associated rituals along with these historic temples. And when we talk about the risks, who perceives it, how they perceive it, the risk perception is also a very important aspect. Like there is a cultural theory of risk. You got a snake, and then the image which you are seeing here, how different people from different places, how they respond. People from India, they treat it as a kind of sacred animal. And whereas some people, they shoot, some people, they thought it could be good for a platter. And some people, run away. So different responses for the same thing. This is where the risk perception matters. Of course, the right side image, it's very common in any of your homes, that how dad sees and how the mom sees and how the kid experiences it. So these are all the different variations of how different risk perceptions. And there are some examples. Today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a variety of case studies, both from the primary point as well as the secondary studies from the Build Back Better documentations. And I'm going to review and trying to see how the kind of common approaches are there in terms of participatory approaches in the disaster recovery and Build Back Better. So this is one example of Kausin village near Cappadocia in Turkey. It's an old Greek town, and there's a huge tufa pinnacles in the city, and which has been formed by the lava dust. And people were living there, and there's a kind of cave village. It is termed as a kind of cave village. So many tourists, it's also a kind of tourist destination. Now, many of you might be knowing that the Turkey lies in the fault line, and it has faced severe earthquakes in the past, and gradually this kind of pinnacles started collapsing. Then the communities who were living here, they were offered some new place nearby, and they asked to relocate. So in fact, given this kind of opportunity, obviously anyone, because these are very prone for the earthquake impacts, but obviously we might have imagined that these people might have taken a better place and go there and settle down. But in a contradiction to this, what we can notice is like people have come back because one of the main important aspect of their livelihood is the tourism. The tourism, because people rely on their livelihoods, their crafts, their embroideries, and their dyeing, the dyeing art and all. They would like to enhance their economy, and what they try to do is they try to settle down, nearby the vicinity of the road, and instead of going somewhere and settling there. So this is one of the economic reasons what makes people drive to settle in these risk-prone areas. And a little bit of one or two slides, I will talk about the theoretical understanding of the vulnerability, the progression of vulnerability. When it is referred with the vulnerability, it is the susceptibility of the community, how they are prone to certain hazards. But it is not just about a hazard. It is about the root causes. Like Ghana has rich in gold mines, Peru, which has rich in gold mines, but still they are a poor country. So, here they are talking about, it is not about the availability of resources, but the access to these resources with their variance in their power structures and their ideologies. Middle East is they have a very rich mineral resources, the fossil resources. and the good economy is there. But then if you look from the gender point of it, they have very limited access. People can't drive a car, you know. So obviously these political resources, these structures, they obviously are some of the root causes which determine certain capabilities. Like in the tsunami, many of the women who have lost their lives because they are unable to swim, whereas the men were able to, protect themselves because they know swimming. So whereas in the Western conditions, the women, they are educated with the swimming education. So like that, each political structure has certain, gives some certain scope for some capacities. Similarly, the dynamic pressures. What are the kind of press freedom, the what kind of local investments, the foreign investments, how will drive the economy, and the rapid population changes. And like, for example, now today, India is putting a lot of expenditure on the mutations and the defense. So obviously, these are all certain major drivers, which will also determine about certain capacities and the scope of funding. And the physical environment, which we talk about, the unsafe conditions, already people were living in unsafe conditions because of their poverty, because of the urbanizations, or lack of and their livelihood. Many of the slums, if you look at it in the major cities, they are located in a marginalized places. So when this kind of situation is there, and then the hazard strikes up, this is where R is equal to H into V. The hazard is multiplied with the vulnerability component. That is where the risk is, proven to be a disaster. And there are also global drivers. The disaster will also determine certain underlying poverty nexus. Whereas the disaster cycle, it talks about the before disaster and after the event and the during the event, and the mitigation, the preparedness, response, recovery. So all these things has a kind of, referred to as a disaster cycle. So whenever a disaster happens, one of the main understanding is we only see it as a kind of one-way process. So something is lost and someone is there to provide you. But we have to see that it is not just one cultural context, but it is for providing, there are two dialects in it. There's haves and the have-nots, the powerful and the powerless, the relief organizations and the victims of the disaster. So these are the two dialects of the disaster recovery. So in many occasions, when the aid agencies used to come over, so they obviously tend to see that this system have failed to cope up with the challenges. They obviously never try to attempt to learn how these systems have survived for a long time, what kind of knowledge that is there, what kind of traditional knowledge and systems that has proven to be efficient, and what made them to fail at this point of time. So this kind of understanding is lacked by many of these aid agencies. So they, and on a other side, the people under the immediate impact of a disaster, they are under the pressure because they don't have shelter, they don't have resources to fulfill their daily life. So obviously, they try to they try to overlook these traditional knowledge systems, and then people tend to accept it. This is how the process goes on. And in fact, there was no very good theories about how the post-disaster space is produced. That is where I was titling my title on the reproduction of the space in disaster context. So I was looking for some good theoretical base which can actually put my understanding of various case studies. Maybe I may have succeeded at the end or not, but at least I'm trying in this model of, I'm using the Henry Lefebvre's theory of production of space, where he talks about three important components. One is the perceived space, conceived space, and the lived space. Where the conceived space, which often refers to the kind of the space which has been designed by certain ideas or certain projections, where a planners worked out a particular place. Whereas the perceived space, it comes with a kind of, how the spatial practices of the communities have produced. And whereas, and these spatial practices in a gradual processes, with time, they tend to develop certain invisible attachment, with these communities, and then how they represent these places. So this is where the lived component of the places works on. And later on, Henry Lefebvre have developed the three different compositions of absolute space and abstract conflicted space and differential spaces. And whereas in absolute space, he normally refers with a kind of, which is a space free from any intellectual involvement, where the man has interacted with the environment, the traditions and the environments have interacted with each other. Whereas in the abstracted and space, that is where the intellectual, the spatial development has been administered by various development inputs. And gradually how this has developed into a conflicted space, and then further with time, how these processes have developed into the differential spaces. I will discuss about this towards the end of the session. Before that, I would like to go through a few examples of the few cases around the world. So I'll be discussing probably, if you look at an earthquakes or any kind of disaster events, Paul Oliver, he talks about the mapping. Cultural mapping is one of the efficient tools. So if you look at, this is a kind of fault line, and after this, he layered different sets of communities, different sets of agricultural practices, different sets of livelihood practices, different sets of religious demographies, all these things within this fault line. And then he tried to look at how there are a lot of convergences within these particular geographies which share certain common traits of the disaster impacts. So I'll be talking a few cases within these fault line today, and of course, tsunami is slightly below. In 1968, in the context of Sicily, there has been a violent earthquake, and it has damaged almost a huge, more than 5,000 people have lost their lives, and 1 lakh people have become homeless. And this is one of the time where that time mayor and the political institutions, they have approached it a very different modernistic approach. They say disaster as an opportunity. How we can take this opportunity to build further and to go along with the modern visions. And this is a place called Ghibellina. Ghibellina is a very popular case. And in this Ghibellina study, what they did was the mayor have invited various artists, architects, and various experts around the world. And this whole Ghibellina has become a kind of place for a laboratory of various ideas. And then what they have produced was, with different modern visions, they have produced different huge, enormous public spaces and modern housing, which are very, independent in nature. Like you can look at these independent houses. Earlier, they were living in a very close-knit surroundings, and also they brought some artists, and they started working on these art installations within the community. And when all these projects were happening simultaneously, at some point of time, obviously there are also certain funding issues, there are also certain mismanagement with the authorities, and certain projects were on hold. Like, for instance, initially they started engaging the communities in the art installations and other things. But then communities gradually they thought that, okay, if something could not be done, then they can easily invest through the art installations. And then with different sets of this thinking process, now today what you can see is an unfinished artwork lying all over. And all these independent housing processes today, no one sees that, it is completely empty because they projected it of 50,000 people, but whereas only 5,000 people live there today. And also what happens to the old village? In the old village, they have also created an artistic expression of 12 hectares of land. Sorry, 12 hectares of land. They created with a kind of concrete junks. And what they did was, in order to remember the old village, they kept the pathways, they kept the streets, they kept as it is, so that the skeleton remains the same. And then so that the traces have, but if you have to imagine 12 hectares of land shredded with concrete. And now what is most common thing in both the Creto and the Ghibellina Nova, which is the new Ghibellina, is the silence. People don't live here, neither not many people live there. So this is where it has brought many challenges with the social life. And there are also certain associations with build back better and back to building better, better building back, and the build back better. So there are different versions to it. But then after the Indian Ocean tsunami, this has emerged as a theme and a kind of framework as a part of the multinational recovery effort. And it looks at a holistic approach towards involving the physical, social, and economic conditions of a community and how these are addressed to improve the resilience. This is how the Build Back Better approach have worked on. So now I will talk about a case with the Turkey. In many of the reconstruction projects, often we see that the people who lost their houses and the government or the aid agencies try to address the people who lost the houses. But very rarely, no one sees that what about the tenants, who doesn't have a valid document of any land, who doesn't own a house. So this is something is not there in either of their acts. The Disaster Management Act in Turkey, it is normally a very top-down approach where the central government is taking care of the recovery process, and they direct the Kaymakam, which is provincial governance, to undertake the reconstruction aspects. So basically they are classified into two categories. One is the emergency and the building construction part of it. Emergency talks more on the relief stage and the rehabilitation part. And the building construction talks more of the transition to the permanent reconstruction part. And within that relocation also, they also talked about, they have two approaches. One is a mass housing approach and the self-help groups approach. And what are the criteria that they follow on? One is the old location, if the old location is at risk, if the old location is destroyed and therefore it takes long time to remove the debris. The third is, if there is an available government land and, so that it can be done very easily, so like that, I'll be talking about 3 different cases here, and especially in Juicy province. And in Juicy, Basilar houses, social housing project, all these 3 projects, they are targeted upon the rentals, people who are not having houses. Because this is where different NGOs have come forward, the International Blue Cross have come forward, and the Catholic Relief Services have come forward to support them financially and also to procure certain land. And this is a kind of setup, an organization setup where there's a government, local government, the Juicy municipality which provides certain land support, whereas some kind of land allocation, and also the technical support, developing some plans, and the international NGOs like the CRS and the IBC, which also provided certain financial support, and the universities, the Technical University of Saqqara University, they provided some technical inputs in developing these plans and building drawings. And this is where the participatory approach, the communities, they kept a rule that at least for each family should spend about 50 working days. I think at the end of the project, about an average 53 have been part of this project. And here, they're about who needs a house, and how do they actually identify identify the beneficiaries. So this is where, when they started asking for the request, who are these beneficiaries, they got about 1,377 list of beneficiaries. But at the end, they again have to ratify certain criteria, whether the lowest income groups and other things like that. And then finally, they have come up with 168 housing delivery. There's a second case study where the Dusi Goliaka Solidarity House project. And here, again, what happened was, here the community was involved in the construction project as well. And they have been involved as a construction laborers, and they have been trained how to construct these houses. And there are also the universities, the Mimar Sinan University and all these, they have helped in the capacity building process, and the Chamber of Architects. So in that way, they've got certain training skills. In this process, what happened was, even after the recovery, certain people got those skills and they got certain employment opportunities later on. And the development, so even the communities were involved in the kind of the house layouts and developing their drawing. I mean, of course, the university was supporting their drawings and other stuff. And some of the family members are trained in the construction process. Whereas in the first case, a few members have participated in the construction process. And here, whereas in the third case, they have actually introduced certain technical improvements, especially with the kind of timber frames and logged with the brick, the brick modules within it. But despite of having certain technical inputs from the expertise, but what one can notice is, what you can see that on the right hand side, you can see the expansions which have happened. There, they have never adopted these the lessons what they learned in the participatory approaches. They went back to the old materials which they were using earlier, and they started expanding these houses, depending on their changing needs. In a disaster context, one of the important phase one has to consider is the transition phase, which is the temporary constructions, the temporary phase. After the disaster, after the relief camps, obviously it takes some time for them to go into the permanent shelter. So it's like in Kenya, of course, this is not a very direct example of the natural disasters, but it is from the political violence, and the government have launched the Come Back Home for the refugees who went out of Kenya. And initially what they did was they developed a kind of temporary shelters with these timber poles, and then with a kind of plastic sheet. But then many of these people, they somehow, though they didn't like the plastic sheet, but then if you look at it, these kind of houses were much bigger than what they were living here. So you can imagine what kind of spaces they were having earlier. So once this kind of temporary investments have already happened, then gradually people with the leftover timber cutoffs, and they started putting some more money, and they're trying to make this as a permanent house. So this is where the transition from a temporary to the more permanent and durable scenario could be also observed, because they are going to spend about 7 to 8 months. Sometimes there were cases where they have spent more than 2 years. And especially in a post-disaster context, in a permanent options, how the architects approach. The architects always, they try to interpret from the participation point of it, because This is a good example from Auroville. When tsunami have occurred, many of these Auroville architects, they have produced their models and they came up with, this is the kind of module I want to provide. But if you look back, the genesis of the architects, there is the imitation of the work they already done earlier somewhere else. So now, irrespective of the fisherman community, how these houses suits or not is a big question. So obviously it becomes a kind of very top-down approach. You have these 1, 2, 3 houses, and why don't you take it? So for whom these houses are meant to, and how do they work? I'll just talk about a small case in my own study. This is down south in Kanyakumari, and you can see that old village, and which is the gray part, and which is 88 houses were damaged. And after the tsunami, the government have given a land for these 88 houses, and obviously certain NGOs came forward, and this was a Roman Catholic village. So they want to take this disaster as an opportunity, and how we can enhance it in a spatial a model so that it can serve for the future requirements. So what they did was they developed the first site with 88 houses who lost these houses. So they got the houses for free, and the tenure for these houses have been given only after 10 years. Whereas the church have realized that we should take this opportunity, and then they started taking funds from the existing communities, and also the church has created certain reserves, and they bought a land which is just next to it. If you can see that this yellow color, and they have developed one more. So now 400 households have become 1,000 households after the tsunami. So which means more than double. So earlier they were all joint families, and now they have become nuclear families. So what happens in the joint families and what happens in the nuclear family? In a joint family, there are always a mutual support systems. Whereas in a nuclear family, now the new context, he has to pay his electricity bill, he has to pay his any installment for the housing loan or anything like that, and he has to manage all his festive resources. He has to manage all his children education. Earlier in a family, if someone is earning less, someone is earning more, so they used to compensate with each other, and there was a very close-knit family. And moreover, the allocation of these houses. The allocation of these houses are also done in a lottery approach. When you take the lottery approach, you don't know who is your neighbor. You might get completely a new set of neighbor. So and these are all the implications of the CRZ regulations, which allows, which restricts not to construct within that 500 meters of the HTL and LTL. So that's why wherever the land acquisition issues are there, and then wherever the possibilities of to acquire land, so church was able to get these kind of land parcels. And at the end, some Gujarati firm, they came and they delivered this kind of a very regular approach of grid array patterns. And so people started gradually, what they did was they started developing as the money has pumped in. They started expanding the kitchens with their local materials at the backyards, and they started developing compound walls. And now the distance also have increased. Earlier it was all in front of the sea, but now the women, they don't know when their husband is coming, because fishermen, they travel for they go in the early morning in 4 o'clock, and they come back, sometimes 11 o'clock, and then sometimes they go twice, thrice. But then the woman doesn't know when these, when the men are coming. So when the men come back from the shore to the shore, they're very hungry, and when there's no food, obviously they get depressed and they go to home. They shout at them. So all these activities, observations have faced by the families, and because of the visual permeability, and earlier they were taking for 4 times into the sea, but now they're only going once a time. So, which has also certain implications on the economic systems and their family systems, how it has weakened their family networks in the festive participations and other things. And the architects, they did ask the communities what kind of houses you want. And the communication was We want a brick and concrete house. But now that is what exactly given to them. And now they realize it's very hot. It's not to their climatic needs. Now, when I was I used to live like a fisherman for almost 7 months, 7 to 8 months with those communities. And I was never realizing why certain people, though they are living in the same location, why they are getting that gap. One of the important aspect was the mental map approach. Some people, they were able to draw the maps, but some people they were not, because for the first time they were touching the pencil. And when I gave them the pencil, I gave them a map. This was done, Tarangambadi, Dr. Benny Kuriakos was involved in it. And when I gave them map of this map before and after, and then gave a landmark, oh, this is Renuka Devi temple, then how they roam around, and then what are the passages they walk around, what are the landmarks they go around. This clearly have showed me that there is a Princess Street on the right-hand side, which actually connects Hindu, Muslim, and Christian communities. Whereas now they are walking from the periphery of the town, which means it is disconnecting that passage. Now people are feeling very lonely. So now a small walking movement has changed the whole society fabric. Now, how people have responded. In the allocation process here, two brothers have got the same house, and then they started developing one single roof to represent one big house. Similarly, the kitchens. And there are females who lost their husbands, and they don't have an economic source, the livelihood source. So then they started expanding with a small shop, and they don't have a playground area. So people started encroaching the neighborhood lands and creating some small play environments. The right side image, what you're seeing is the toilet, which was provided by the agency, and now it is converted as a puja room because it doesn't adhere to the Vastu guidelines. I visited the same places after again in 8 years, and I was surprised to see how these core dwellings concepts have changed, how people have come back with their vibrant, bright colors, and how they started plantations in their compounds and the streets, how they also created the public places with the bell tower, similar to exactly the same parish church which was there in the old city. And in between spaces, they created some sprayer spaces for the elderly people. So people started adjusting to it. People started innovating themselves, and they started bringing back these traditions back, but in a new form. This is something which is, in order to understand the cultural responsiveness, one has to look at the vibrant of more than 8 to 10 years. I'll also take from the El Salvador examples, where this is also has been stuck up by various earthquakes and landslides. And there's also added to that, there is also the civil wars, which are already associated with it. And here they looked at the reconstruction proposals are always looked at 3 aspects: emergency phase, the stabilization, rehabilitation, and the humanitarian aid, and the recovery and reconstruction, which this topic is going to talk about. And what are the 2 approaches? One is a contractor build approach and the progressive housing. El Salvador, they actually worked out with a progressive approach. The step 1, step 2, step 3. Here, what they did was the contractors and the unskilled labor, so they tried to create a structural elements, and then they, each of these family, they also have given certain training. Now, if you look at the partial construction, like there's the windows and the lintels have been laid, and the bedrooms, in the bedroom, they only covered a brickwork up to 1.1 meter height and 1.7 meter height. So this is a kind of first phase. And the construction supervisors for every 31 are allocated. And then later on, the communities have taken part. They tried to put some more funds into it, and they got certain training, and they tried to cover it. The third part is about the services, where they tried to develop the water supply and sanitation. And here you can see that after that, the fourth part, which is more of the long-term maintenance, the training in how you maintain these places, how you manage the rainwater harvesting techniques. All these things were provided. Different community workshops were provided. So this is one of the progressive approach. How progressive approach is different from a co-dwelling approach. Co-dwelling, they can expand what you have seen in the earlier examples. But in a progressive approach, it's the same thing which they are actually building it in a progressive way. One partially, and then it develops into a full scope. Similarly, in examples from Peru, Peru is also one of the important locations for the earthquake affected areas. And what they did was they tried to, they come out of with this rammed earth construction techniques, and then they try to develop this with the Quincy techniques, where there is a kind of timber frame, woven timber frame, and then they use a kind of stabilized motor on it. And this is how the Quincy techniques have been adopted. But now the big impact, what earlier before this earthquake, only 7% of the construction was relying on the Quincy techniques. But now the national housing stock, it has raised up to 30% because the tricks for building schools and the community buildings have been enhanced with these kind of programs. And in terms of cost reduction also, this has proven to be a very efficient aspect. And they have laid out a very management process and the organizational approaches with it. Now, what you can see is 18 years after, things have changed. In the beginning, they have shown a very positive response, but 18 years after, there are a lot of drought, which is in the northeast part of the Peru, and people have started migrating almost and settling down in these kind of open areas. And that has gradually, affected the cultivation processes, and also how these the free land, the area of free land for a better quality, and the land and the migrant, because they have got more land possibilities. So it has also created a different demand. And brick and concrete industries have come up. So now what you can see is the same thing has been modified into the brick and concrete houses. So once a successful model has gone back to a different stage because there are other drivers associated to it. Similarly, big places in Alto Mayo in the similar context, where public areas are they get neglected, except a few places where there are certain lighting and trees and benches. But otherwise, because of this migration population coming over, and 1.33 million hectares of land has been deforested. Okay, so there's other aspects which are flowing through it. And when there's lack of planning processes within it, how these new settlements could be handled along with the old settlements, and the impacts of the climate change, So in Peru itself.
So sorry to disturb you.
Yeah.
I'll have to request you to wrap this up.
Yes, I'm wrapping up.
Yeah?
I'm wrapping up.
Thank you.
So one interesting part in this Peru is in one of the case, they can see that they don't have the proper infrastructure in roads and everything, but they invested to build their stone church in Queuspilacta, and which has to do with their self-esteem, because that is the pride of their places. So they try to look at to invest more on rather than the basic necessities. They invested on the cultural factors. So out of all these cases, what I would like to come up with is, the kind of control paradigm, how the participation goes on from a bottom-up to a top-down approaches. So the moment you are talking about the manipulation, it is almost no control. And just giving an information is a limited control, consultation, collaborative. Whereas the empowerment, when you empower them, teach a man a fish, give a man a fish, it will feed him for a day, but teach a man how to fish, it will feed him for the life and his generations. So this is where I talk about the strategy of the participatory approaches and how it goes with different levels. And this is where the production of space from the pre-disaster context, which is more of a vernacular processes with all its challenges and the vulnerable context. And whereas in the post-disaster context, it is more to do with the transitional processes. And Bono, he summarizes this whole reconstruction space into the kind of how this reconstruction space is manifested through discourse, the options and choices, land issues and tenures, the materiality, the social networks, and the power. So this is what I want to like to end this session. So I try to bring back this production of space, and what you look at it is the absolute space with the tradition space and the development, which was an ongoing development. And then the disaster changes its whole platform, which creates a platform for a transition space and gradually leading to the post-disaster permanent shelter spaces. And this is where the planners or the architects or the NGOs, the development agencies come together, and the communities have already had an experience of the transition space and how they mold themselves. And sometimes whatever the approach it is, whether it is a pure participatory approach or not, the adaptation process, how again it is shaped and reshaped and creates a differential spaces. And in the differential spaces, that is where we observe that people are going back to the local traditions, which we see in absolute spaces. And the personalization is a natural response to the cultural deficiencies in the built environment. So, I mean, this model I'm still working on, but I would not say that it's a very, but what I'm trying to see is kind of an approach, how the traditions are coming back and how the new methods are coming in. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was a very enlightening session, I must say, and especially the three different forms of Build Back Better that you showed, the examples at Turkey, Italy, and El Salvador. And lastly, the social implications that you spoke about of the Build Better practices, especially with respect to Kovalam. So they were an eye-opener. And we have a couple of questions we would like to direct to you. So the first question is by architect Anay, who asked that why even after more than 100 years of recurrent river flooding and accumulated traditional knowledge to recover, we are still failing to cope up with challenges of floods in India. Why are we trying to tame rivers through bunds and embankments when it's failing to save communities and resources? And what is the role of architects and planners in disaster recovery and Build Back Better in the context of India's river flooding? What could be the norms and regulations?
See, I think there are too many questions, but I can try to answer one aspect, one strong aspect.
Yes, sir.
When you talk about river, okay, we are not, when we talk about certain flooding in certain areas, we should not see as the settlement point of it. We should see it as an ecosystem. What happens in Brahmaputra river floods, sometimes the reason lies in China. They build dams, but it happens, the impact is seen somewhere in Assam. Okay. Because the problem doesn't lie in that settlement. The problem lies somewhere else. Okay. So this is where the policy matters in China is different. The policy matters in Uttarakhand is different and Himachal Pradesh is different. The central policies are different and the local policies are different. This is one of the biggest challenge when we see a river. What you see, the Ganges, starting from Gangotri to Hooghly, you know, it is the Ganges, but then each state has a different approach towards it. So I think this is where bringing different spatial scales within this ecosystem is very important. Like Varanasi, if you ever see Varanasi, on the left-hand side where you have the sacred places, on the right-hand side, you don't have anything. Okay, so there is a knowledge that went into the framing that settlement. But on the right-hand side, you almost see nothing in that. Only everything is on the left-hand side. Okay, so one has to look at the knowledge, the topographical knowledge, how it went in from ages. Also, that is also, that depends on the context, you know, I can say. But in terms of norms, and I think this time will be too short even to discuss it. But what I can say is the norms, there are mismatches from norms. There are mismatches in spatial scales. We see the disaster flood in a narrowed down approach with a spatial approach, especially with the focused area approach rather than the ecosystem approach. I think this is one thing we look at.
Right, sir. another question we have that in many ways we see architecture as a profession is slightly straying away from ground realities of India with rural India and that context. And we can call whatever we are doing in the urban situation as maybe imitation or aspiration, whatever we may term it. But most architects and designers don't engage with local build forms or local special models or building materials anymore. How can we correct this? And with, I would like to refer to what you said in the end that the house owner himself or herself reverts back to personalization of space or the traditional building knowledges. But even as professionals here, on the other hand, we are going in the other direction. So how can we correct that?
See, at least as an from person coming from education, one big change I have seen was, I think many of the people who are listening this seminar, possibly some teachers are there. How many times our students are interacting with the rural settings? There were times when I have taken my students to some village. I asked them to drink water from the well. They saw, sir, there is a mendak in the well, I cannot drink. So for them, that awareness of the rural setting is somehow we are lacking in our education. Okay. I think this is the first thing we need to develop in our education system for the future generation so that they interact with the rural settings. You can take the training and placements in all the education systems. How many people are actually going into rural settings and work? Out of 100 people, 1 or 2. At least in my career, 3 or 4 people who really went and settled in rural settlements context. Okay, but a lot of work has been, at least it is there. There's a lot of scope in that. I think our education system itself can mold this. There's a big challenge for all our teachers to bring this particular knowledge to our future generations. That is one thing. The second thing is when people are working in rural settlements, you go with the pre-assumptions that they don't know anything. That is something you have to learn to unlearn. When I was working in tsunami recovery, initially I went with a tuck, belt and a camera. They thought I was a government official. After that, sometime when I was living like a fisherman, I used to go to fishing in Indian Ocean. I realized what is hungry means. 6 घंटे Indian Ocean में fishing करके वापस आए तो you starve like anything. To harbor the boat, it takes 1 hour. Okay, I never realized to catch diesel, walk for 2 kilometers. I never realized how a pregnant woman will wait at the bus stop and to go to a nearby hospital for 2-3 miles away. In Uttarakhand, when I was working, how children go for 5 kilometers for their school. This interaction is very much needed if someone is working in the rural settings. The pre-assumption se acha, you start learning to unlearn the things and see from a different perspective.
Wonderful, sir. That was wonderful. And the key word here is, I guess, is learn to unlearn, as architect Akshay Kumar Verma has also pointed out. One last question we'll take for now, sir, with your question and answer session. So, zooming out at an urban planning or a urban scale, if we look at vernacular architecture, how do you predict the future of community participation in this? Because this is where you're tending towards when you're talking about people and the architecture. So, for example, if we talk about local area plans in Delhi, where resident welfare associations are formally part of the planning process for the DP. So something like that. In places where there are already formal processes set in place, how do you see this happening or working out, community participation?
See, in an urban level, it's a very different challenge completely. I agree with that. But there are also some best practices, what we can learn from the participatory models, at least from my experience when I was working in Sweden. We were part of moving a complete town, Kiruna, which I didn't explain in this study, which I was supposed to, but then it was on a natural disaster. It was a mining disaster. So I didn't explain it in this jargon. There was a mining town and where the town, because the mine came under the town and we were forced to move the town to somewhere else. And there, the Swedish approach was a complete bottom-up approach. including the way they have planned the highways. They have completely shifted the highways at some point of time, because the reindeer population have these gauging routes, so it will disrupt their ecosystem. So they completely, with these small Sami tribes which were living in that area, and they have taken a very bottom-up approach, which was possible at that level of population of 9 million population. But whereas in Indian population, we are talking about 1.5 billion, and also in a given context, this is where the innovation from an architect has to come. Okay, how participatory processes could be enhanced. So there are now, with the digital tools, with the various other platforms, the problem with this process is there are too many responses, and how we actually synthesize them is the biggest challenge. Even in Sweden, we face that. There is another project on the industrial corridor, Bothnian Corridor project, which was a part of 5 countries, 29 partners. Okay, 29 partners. But then, but at least we were all engaged. Though I have never seen a research project, at least in here in India, in a built environment perspective, with 29 partners in an architectural research project. Okay, but whereas in some other countries, I have personally seen that, in a research they are depositing and they are investing that. Because they don't have time. The planning offices will not have time, to do this consultation process. But then that is where academic bodies are. This is where the role of universities and academic institutions will do a job. Like, even if you have seen Dr. Benny Kuriakos' work, in his work in Tarangambadi, a lot of academic institutions, students came forward and became a team. And this is where the academic becomes an interface between the practice and the thought process of participation.
Wonderful thought, sir. I think with that, we will end the question and answer session for this 4th session of our webinar. And we will be waiting for a couple of minutes to let the other panelists join. I believe we have a couple of panelists already who have signed in. Thank you, sir, for this very enlightening presentation that you have given today. And to all the viewers, I would like to remind, please stay signed in. We have a panel discussion coming up in a couple of minutes. With this, I would like to hand over the floor to my colleague and the coordinator of National Scientific Committee on Vernacular Architecture for ICOMOS India, architect Purva Patil. Purva ma'am, can you please take over for the time being?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So request you to mute your mic for a couple of minutes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, we are waiting for some panelists. So once they joined it, we'll start the session.
Okay.